here. I tell you. There are a lot of familiar faces here. I mean, hell, half of you were involved in the history of NA. Maybe all of you involved in the history of NA. This is the history of NA, isn't it? There are a bunch of you who have been involved in the early sickness in your regions and areas and local communities. Probably have a lot of stories to tell. One of these days we probably ought to tell some of those stories. You know, the sickest it got back then. Something like that. That'd be fun, wouldn't it? Maybe tonight we'll do some of that. Maybe we just cut some of the other stuff short and do some of that. I think that would be fun because I don't understand why some of you are here. I mean, you know, some of you have heard me do this, what, half a dozen times? You know, I don't know, insanity, I guess, you know. Have to be pretty sick to find this program when we did, huh? Anyway, excuse me? You figure maybe it'll change? Okay. 1842. Anyway, what I want to try and do more than anything else is give you a feel for the history of Narcotics Anonymous. I mean, we're learning about the dates and the facts, and as time goes on, more of that will surface. I know more and have a better idea about the early history of Narcotics Anonymous today. Come on in, gang. Go for it. There's rum in front. Bring a chair. There's some out there. Than I did last year at this time. So it will change from last year to this year. I'm sure there's more to be learned. I know that there are pieces missing. What I want to give you more than anything else is a feeling that you are part of the history of Narcotics Anonymous. That we are all pioneers today. That this is a period in the history of NA where there's tremendous growth and there's a job for each of us to do. That we're all pioneers. And I believe that. I firmly believe that. The time for being passé and sitting on our asses, it isn't now. Do that in 20 years. No. Now we need to continue going about the business and going about the quest to help NA grow. Where does NA come from? Well, I mean, that's hard to say. Probably the most obvious answer is NA grew out of a need. And I think there's a statement that I can quote, something like that, that Jimmy talked about at a talk he gave in 1973, where he talked about growing out of a need. He talked about the fact that addicts didn't recover. That every once in a while, one would show up in and around AA, and they'd shine for a brief moment and be gone. And I think that's always been the case. I don't think there's anything, magic about applying this basic approach, the 12-step approach, to addicts. I imagine that's happened hundreds of times in hundreds of different places. I don't think we probably know but a couple of them. There are some early references that there's something like that could have been going on. The earliest reference that I can find of anything like that comes in a book called Alcohol, Science, and Society on page 472. And this book is describing a talk that Bill Wilson gave at Yale University in 1944. And he was asked a question that had to do with an organization similar to AA that works among addicts. And we have no idea what they're talking about at this point. We don't know. But there is the implication that there was something going on. And you got to remember, this is fairly early. This is 1944, so what is that? 5 years after the name Alcoholics Anonymous was selected for the book. That's pretty early on. We do have some references down a little bit beyond that. We have some references in the late 40s. And there's some contradicting information about this application of these 12 steps for addicts. I have a couple of articles, and I understand there are other ones that describe some things that took place. I have a copy of an article from Time magazine, May 7th, 1951, that talks about Narcotics Anonymous. I have a pretty extensive article from August 7th, 1954, and that's a Saturday Evening Post that talks about, that's what the cover looked like, and it says, "The Drug Addicts Who Cure One Another." And there's an article on this whole phenomenon. Here's what it looks like. One of the things I didn't do this time that I did last year was I brought a lot of goodies last year that I didn't bring this time. I just didn't have room for them. And it's neat to be able to touch some of the history of Narcotics Anonymous, and in some ways I'm real sorry I didn't bring those. Maybe next time. This article's real interesting because it tells the story, and I have no reason to believe that it's not accurate. The third article I'll refer to, or really the two, is an article in a thing called The War Cry. And that's a journal of or a publication of the Salvation Army that has a reference to the Narcotics Anonymous. I'll read that first. It's a story of a person named Brigadier Dorothy Berry, and her efforts working with addicts. And one of the things it says is that she began working with addicts about 1945 in the prisons near New York City. Primarily women. She had some contact and link with the Lexington, Kentucky, the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital. There's a line that says, "Upon request, the Brigadier sends patients to the Lexington, Kentucky Hospital. Since 1948, they have always met the Brigadier and Mrs. Peter Way, the local Corps officer, met by Brigadier and Mrs. Peter Way, the local Corps officer. One of the great helps to addicts is Narcotics Anonymous. Brigadier Berry has worked with NA since it first started back in 1947, when she provided a meeting place for the group in a room in the Manhattan Men's Social Club. Since then, she has attended hundreds of their meetings, sometimes visiting a parents group the same evening. The parents group, known as CMCNA, adopted the name Committee for Medical Control of Narcotics Addiction, so on and so forth. So here's a reference back in 1947. I can't substantiate that, and there is a tie here with the Salvation Army. I don't know if that date is accurate. I have dates of 1948 and 1950 in a couple of articles. But that's an interesting piece. And I'll tell a tale after I read some of these experts that may explain how some of these things fit together, so it won't be quite as confusing as it is right now. In this Saturday Evening Post article, which I've received in the last year, it talks about a series of groups springing out of the United States Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. And I was given a copy of this article, and I was reading along. The narco group of the United States Public Health Service Hospital at Lexington, Kentucky has a transient membership of about 80 men and women patients. The group mails a monthly newsletter, The Key, free to those who want it. Currently a list of 500 names, and so on and so forth. There are some fantastic things in this article that tie together a lot of missing pieces. Anyway, it tells a story of a man. We don't know his name for sure. And we're talking about in February of 1947. Some months later. No, wrong. We're talking about 1944 again. In June of that year, an inebriate mining engineer, whom we'll call Houston, hit bottom with his drinking in Montgomery, Alabama. The local AAs dried him up. Houston gobbled the AA program and began helping other alcoholics. One of the drunks he worked with, a sales executive who can be called Harry, was involved not only with alcohol but also morphine. AA took care of the alcoholic factor, but left Harry's drug habit unchanged. Okay, so here's this guy who gets sober in AA, whatever that means. And he begins working with others, as was very common. And he runs across a dope fiend. And AA works for the guy, except he doesn't get clean. He continues to use drugs. And he's in and out, and he's in and out. And this guy was a friend. Someone he 12-stepped. And he got real interested in it. And it sparked something in him. Some months later, no, I got to go back. During this period, Houston, through one of those coincidences which AAs like to attribute to a higher power, was transferred by his employers to Frankfort, Kentucky, just a few miles from Lexington. Harry's troubles kept running through my brain, kept jumping through my brain, Houston says. Quote, I was convinced that the 12 suggested steps would work as well for drugs as for alcohol if conscientiously applied. One day I called on Dr. V.H. Vogel, the medical officer then in charge of Lexington. I told him of our work with Harry and offered to assist in starting a group in the hospital. Dr. Vogel accepted the offer, and on February 16, 1947, the first meeting was held. Weekly meetings have been going ever since. This was a group called Addicts Anonymous, the narco group of Addicts Anonymous. And then it goes on to talk about later in 1947, Harry came back. He was sent to Lexington, this guy that the guy had worked with before. And he was in once, and he floundered around, went out, used, came back, and then got clean in 1948. Then in the fall of 1948, there arrived at Lexington an addict named Dan, who'd been there before. It was, in fact, his 7th trip. The doctors assumed that he'd continue his periodic visits until he died. This same Dan later founded the small but significant Narcotics Anonymous group in New York. Dan's personal history is a story of apparently incurable addict, apparently cured. Okay, so here comes this guy. And the way it looks, although we're not quite sure of this connection with Brigadier Dorothy Berry, she's in and out of Lexington. She's sending people to Lexington. She's got connections in Lexington, so there's a tie there between that Norco group. The only thing that doesn't fit is the dates. The 1947 dates that may be referred to in this Salvation Army might be the date of the founding of Addicts Anonymous in Lexington. And she did have some contact there. It says so in the article. Out of this attempt in Lexington, Kentucky, grows several things. One of them is this guy, Dan, goes to New York and starts something called Narcotics Anonymous, or hooks up with Brigadier Berry and gets a meeting hall in the Salvation Army and has NA meetings outside of the institutions. I suspect that Major Berry started some meetings like Addicts Anonymous with women in the women's prisons in and around New York, prior to that. There are other names that come up like Ray Lopez. There's some names that come up in those early days. We don't know the exact source of the name Narcotics Anonymous and its use there. Some people attribute it to where's that set of brains? A guy named Chuck McGee. Yeah. We don't really know. It seems as if Dan gets clean in Lexington, hooks up with this gal in the Salvation Army, goes and starts some meetings called Narcotics Anonymous in New York City, which last probably 8 to 10 years before they die out. Dan dies a few years later. Anyway, another thing that happens out of this group at Lexington is in Lorton, Virginia. There's a group called the Nortrol Group, which is Lorton spelled backwards, Lorton Federal Penitentiary in Virginia, that does the same thing. There is another group down in Houston, Texas, Fort Worth. Wait a second. The PHF, Public Health Service Hospital at Fort Worth. There's a connection in the prison system, the federal prison system. In the West, there is something called habit-forming drugs, HFD groups, and those are referred to in this article too. Where is this? Yeah. Significant paragraph here, and I'll reread it. I read it before. To date, the AA type of group therapy has been effective ingredient of cures. The word used here means no drugs for a year or more, and an intent of permanent abstinence. In at least 200 cases, some of these, including Dan, the founder of the New York group, have been pronounced medically hopeless. The narco group of the United States Public Health Service hospitals at Lexington, Kentucky has a transient membership of about 80 men and women patients. The group mails a monthly newsletter, The Key, free to those who want it. Currently a list of 500 names. Many of these are interested but non-addicted friends. Most are mail-order members of the group, addicts who have left the hospital and have been without drugs for periods ranging from a few weeks to several years. The HFD, Habit-Forming Drug Group, is a loosely affiliated fellowship of California ex-addicts who keep clean, the addict's term for a state of abstinence, by attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings with volunteer AA sponsors. The federal prison at Lorton, Virginia has a prisoner group which attracts 30 men to its weekly meetings. Narcotics Anonymous in New York is the sole free world outside of institution group which conducts its own weekly open to the public meetings in the AA tradition, and so on and so forth. So we see a network hooked in with the prison systems, with the Salvation Army, and this newsletter sent out of Lexington, Kentucky. All of this predates what we normally consider the founding of Narcotics Anonymous by several years. By 3 years, in fact, at least. 5, 6 years before the 1953 date. What I suspect, and all those things died out, no NA group to existence today traces its origin to any of that. What I suspect happened, and in reading that last paragraph, light bulbs went off in my head, because in the founding minutes of the NA we attribute our existence to are a couple of lines. There's a line in here at the 5th, August 31st, 1953 this is. The 5th committee meeting held at 8 p.m. at 10146 Stagg Street. Our purpose has been taken from the key. Our purpose. Narcotics Anonymous. This is an informal group of drug addicts banded together to help one another renew their strength in remaining free of drug addiction. Our precepts are patterned after those of Alcoholics Anonymous, to which all credit is given and precedence is acknowledged. We claim no originality, but since we believe that the causes of alcoholism and addiction are basically the same, we wish to apply to our lives the truths and principles which have benefited so many otherwise helpless individuals. We believe that by so doing we can regain and maintain our health and sanity. It will be the purpose of this group to endeavor to foster means of rehabilitation for the addict and to carry a message of hope for the future to those who have become enslaved by the use of habit-forming drugs. Starting Monday night, October 5th, 1953, and each Monday night thereafter at 8:30 p.m. Corner of Cantera and Claiborne, Sun Valley, California, directly behind the Sunland Lumber Company. That's an announcement of our first meeting as we know it. Okay, now I'm guessing at this point, but from this evidence, the picture I get is that there is knowledge of application of AA's principles to addicts. There is knowledge of this network of recovering addicts. There is knowledge of the name Narcotics Anonymous. There are copies of something called The Key, which is that newsletter that comes out of Lexington, that are floating around the AA fellowship in Southern California in the early 1950s. Where do the Committee of Six, who held a meeting August 17th, 1953 for the purpose of forming a San Fernando Valley Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous group, come from? They come from addicts in AA in Southern California in the early 50s. And I think that's the connection. I believe at this point that the concept of applying the 12 steps to addicts comes from Lexington, Kentucky, in the federal hospital there, Addicts Anonymous. I believe at this point that the name Narcotics Anonymous probably comes from New York. And what happened in California in 1953 was a change in philosophy that took place. Up until that time, we'd been dealing with word substitution, powerless over drugs, powerless over narcotics, powerless over sedatives. We'd been dealing with the direct application of AA steps to addicts. What happened in Southern California is the we's got added and it got changed to powerless over addiction. And like is true in most of the places you come from, the early meetings were on again, off again. My perception of the 1950s anywhere is that there was no consistency. In the talk that Jimmy gave, he talks about, by the way, one of the lines in there is that confirms the suspicion is before Narcotics Anonymous there was HFD. These were, let me quote it exactly. Before NA there was HFD, habit-forming drug groups. These were hidden. These were 1 or 2 or 3 people meeting in apartments here and there. Nobody knew where they were. They demanded certain things and they were dominated by 1 person or 2 persons. You know, you and I don't go for authority. We don't like authority. A few people I met down in Skid Row years ago from East LA formed another group known as Addicts Anonymous. They infringed on the AA name and they died very quickly because they too were dominated by 1 man. We had another group started in the valley that also called itself HFD. So there's a lot of attempts to do this. In California, in Kentucky, in New York, in Virginia, in Texas, in many places in the United States in this time period. There are a lot of attempts to form a 12-step fellowship for addicts. They all fizzle out and die at one point or another, including California. The 50s were a period of inconsistency. I don't know where you all come from, but most local fellowships had a lot of false starts before they got a group going that's lasted. Usually there were attempts to start NA. I have lists of meetings going back until like 72. There isn't a meeting. There may be one or two meetings on the 1972 list that's still going. There were lots of attempts and lots died out. We started long before NA was a reality, even in name. We grew out of a need. We found, those of us who were members had come into AA and found we could recover. In AA, we found out that many addicts were still going down the road of degradation and death. And we thought it was right that we should try to do something. But you know, we're funny people. The more we try to do things together, the more we fight each other. And the more we tear each other apart. Tear down the very thing we're trying to build. And that's been the history up until a few short years ago of Narcotics Anonymous. We tore down as fast as we built. That's the kind of people we are, and we must recognize that to recover. All of us must know the nature of the illness, the nature of the addict, and the nature of recovery. All these things are necessary to grow and to live and to change. We started from resentments, and resentments made us grow. I think that's a pretty good description of how it was. What was NA like back in those days? From what I can piece together in California, NA was something that happened sporadically. Someone would come in and they'd start a meeting up and they'd run it for a few months and the person would go out and everybody go back to AA. There was a place called Schreier's Dryer in California in this time frame that they used to count heads once a week. And if there were more alcoholics, they'd have an AA meeting. If there were more dope fiends, they'd have an NA meeting. People got out of an AA meeting and would go out to coffee, and there were a lot of meetings held like that. There were the rabbit meetings held in people's houses and nobody knew where they were. And you go to a meeting this week and they tell you where it would be next week. And there was no consistency. Even in the founding minutes, every member who was involved in the founding minutes, who was mentioned in the initial committee, resigned within the first few months. So there was a lot of turnover, and there were people in and out. And that's the way it was, and I think that's the way it was everywhere. I think that's the way it was from what I can gather in the East as well as the West in that time frame, until these groups died out. In 1959, NA died. They say, or the story is that NA became dominated by one man and stopped adhering to the traditions, or one person, I don't know if it was a man or a woman, in the 1950s. And in 1959, they shut the doors of Narcotics Anonymous. In either December of 1959 or in January of 1960, December of 59 or January of 1960, 4 of the original people, or 4 individuals, picked up the pieces and started a group. And that group met in the same location every week until the last year or two, when they had to do something else, find another place to meet. There was a meeting in the same location dating from 1960. That's confirmed by stories in the basic text. That's confirmed by Bob B's story, I found the only NA meeting in the world. If you count the time frames, that's confirmed by tapes by Jack Whaley, by Chuck S., and people who came around the fellowship in the early 60s. What they describe is they describe 1 or 2 or 3 people sitting in a room once a week in Sun Valley, in Sun Valley, or actually in Studio City, California, and they come back the next week and there's maybe 2 or 3 other people, but there's some consistency every week. That part of it's pretty well documented, but that's the point. And then it started to grow in the 60s. At this same time frame, the Addicts Anonymous, the Narcotics Anonymous, the HFD groups, the Nortrol group died out. and we can't find any trace of them past the early 60s. There was no support. Was there knowledge of these groups back and forth in communication?